Sienna God, hello all. OSDA, well, it'll be Sonali when you watch this. OSDA, good evening, and Wado, thank you for watching. This is day 10, part B of Black Rednecks and White Liberals by Thomas Sowell, and I just like, I don't know about y'all, but my freaking mind continues to get blown. I don't know. It was not until the late 18th century that there was even an intellectual movement, much less a political movement, for the abolition of slavery. And those in these movements were distinctly in the minority, even in the West, and had no counterparts outside the East. Distinctly in the minority, even in the West, and had no counterparts outside the West. What was historically unusual was the emergence in the late 18th century for a strong moral sense that slavery was so wrong that Christians could not in good conscience enslave anyone or countenance the continuation of this institution among themselves or others, nor was this view confined to religious leaders or congregations. Adam Smith in Britain and Montesquieu, Montesquieu in France, were among the secular intellectuals who wrote against slavery in the 18th century. Slavery was one of a number of long-lasting institutions and traditions which were being questioned in the 18th century in the West. Before then, both secular and religious philosophers, going back to Plato, had seen the mundane physical world as being far less important than the ideal of spiritual world, so that being right and free in one's mind was more important than one's fate in the physical world. Dissipating one's energies trying to reform the practices of a sinful world was considered less important than bringing one's own soul into line with spiritual imperatives. To the religious, the world of the here and now was a transient thing, a prelude and a testing ground for the world that really mattered, the world of eternity. However, as a humanistic philosophy began to affect both secular and religious thought, what happened in the mundane physical world began to assume greater importance than it had before in the eyes of intellectuals, philosophers, and religious leaders. As the fate of human beings in the here and now loomed larger as a moral concern, the fate of slaves became part of the intellectual and moral agenda of the times. Over the centuries, established religious institutions in the West, notably the Catholic Church, but later including also established Protestant denominations, had made their peace with the institution of slavery as a fact of life and produced traditional rationales to reconcile it with the message of Christianity. What? Now these institutions, traditions, and rationales came under fire from within as well as outside the religious community across a broad front of which slavery was just one battleground. Religious minorities such as the Quakers or the evangelicals within the Anglican Church could not simply rely on religious tradition and authority because their very existence was based on a questioning and, in some cases, a break with those traditions and authorities. These insurgents had to think independently about slavery as about other things and derive their own conclusions, as most people do not have to think through things which have been accepted facts of life for centuries. The rising class of secular intellectuals in the West could even less rely on the authority of the established religious institutions. This did not mean that either secular or religious insurgents were automatically anti-slavery. What it meant was that they both had to evolve some intellectually and morally defensible position because they could not simply base themselves on existing beliefs or practices. Different individuals resolved the issues differently, but out of the process came some who began to see slavery as an intolerable evil. Quakers were the first religious group to find slavery morally intolerable, a threat to their own external salvation, rather than simply a temporal misfortune of others. Yet even the Quakers did not arrive at this conclusion all at once. In the 17th and early 18th centuries, there were Quaker plantation owners in the West Indies and Quaker slave traders operating from London, Philadelphia, and Newport, Rhode Island. As late as 1705, most of the leaders of the Philadelphia Quakers owned slaves. Wow. However, as anti-slavery sentiment grew among the Quakers, slave ownership among these leaders declined to 10% by 1756. Then, just 2 years later, the Philadelphia Quakers banned the ownership of slaves by its members. In England as well, Quakers were the first to require members of their congregations to cease being slave owners. Evangelicals in the Anglican Church, notably William Wilberforce in Parliament, joined the Quakers and took the issue to the general public with a decades-long political struggle to get the British government to ban the trading of slaves. Only optimists thought this possible at the time, and even the leaders of the anti-slavery movement did not at first attempt to direct abolition of the institution of slavery itself, hoping instead that stopping the buying and selling of human beings would dry up the source and cause slavery as an institution to wither on the vine. Okay. At this juncture in history, Britain was the world's largest slave trader. Wow. And the powerful vested interests which this created were able to roundly defeat early attempts to get Parliament to ban the trade. In the long run, however, such powerful opposition to the proposed ban, combined with equal tenacity on either side, simply dragged out the political struggle for decades, making ever wider circles of people aware of the issue. Something that had never been a public issue before now became a subject of inescapable and heated controversy for years on end. Slavery could no longer be accepted as simply one of those facts of life that most people do not bother to think about. The long, drawn-out political controversy meant that more and more people had to think about it, and many who began to think about slavery turned against it. Eventually, such strong feelings were aroused among the British public that anti-slavery petitions with unprecedented numbers of signatures poured into Parliament from around the country from people in all walks of life, until the mounting political pressures forced not only a banning of the international slave trade in 1808, but eventually swept the anti-slavery forces on beyond their original goals toward the direct abolition of the institution of slavery itself. Nor was this a transient phenomenon. For more than a century, these political forces were so unremitting that no British government of any party could ignore them, and even British politicians and colonial officers with no personal sense of a need to ban slavery were nevertheless forced further in that direction by political pressures. Not only were Britain's BRITONS forbidden to trade or hold slaves, the British Navy intercepted slave ships from other nations on the high seas, set the slaves free, and confiscated the ships. Only Britain's overwhelming power made this possible, and even then, not against a powerful nation like France, but only extraordinary political pressures at home made it necessary. Moreover, this was a moral crusade continually fanned by reports from British missionaries in Africa and elsewhere, as well as by anti-slavery sentiments from other sources. Queen Victoria told Harriet Beecher Stowe that she had wept when she read Uncle Tom's Cabin. Yet one of the signs of our own times is that intellectuals have made desperate but futile efforts to depict the worldwide British anti-slavery crusade as somehow motivated by economic self-interest rather than by the kinds of morals imperatives activating the kinds of people that today's intellectuals find hard to understand. At the time, however, John Stuart Mill, Stuart S-T-U-R-A-T, Mill, M-I-L-L, said that the British, in quotes, for the last half-century have spent annual sums equal to the revenue of a small kingdom in blockading the Africa coast for a cause in which we not only had no interest, but which was contrary to our pecuniary, P-E-C-U-N-I-A-R-Y, interest, end quote. While Britain spearheaded the anti-slavery movement in the world, the 19th century saw anti-slavery feelings spread until they became common throughout Western civilization, and only in Western civilization. By 1888, every country in the Western Hemisphere had abolished slavery, as had all European and European offshoot nations around the world. Yet attempts to abolish slavery in the non-Western world provoked armed uprisings within the Ottoman Empire, and elsewhere peoples unable to directly mount challenges on the battlefield nevertheless engaged in massive invasions and concealments of their continued trade in human beings. After the open slave market in Istanbul was shut down, slaves continued to be smuggled in, often at night and in small groups from the Caucasus, C-A-U-C-A-S-U-S, and from around the Black Sea, among other places. Suppressing the slave trade across the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea was much harder and took much longer than suppressing the Atlantic slave trade. While slaves were transported across the Atlantic in large ships packed with their human cargoes, slaves were carried in smaller and more numerous vessels along with rice, fish, and other merchandise from East Africa to the Islamic world. British naval patrols were overwhelmed by the task of sorting out Which of the innumerable Arab vessels were carrying slaves at any given time and place, and these patrols were never able to intercept more than a fraction of the slaves being shipped out of East Africa to the Islamic world of the Middle East and North Africa. Moreover, such success as the British had on the high seas led to a shifting of more of the slave trade to land, and especially to inland areas away from ports and coastal outposts where British naval power could be exerted. With the passage of time, however, especially as other European powers began to adopt anti-slavery policies, not only for themselves but for other nations that they conquered or influenced, the slave trade was forced to retreat further, though not to surrender. Moreover, the retreat of the slave trade did not mean the abolition of slavery itself. A number of European nations, as well as the United States, officially banned the international slave trade in the early 19th century, and treaties among them decades later provided various means of making the ban more effective. But while nations could deter other nations from slave trading, it was much more difficult to deter freelance pirates or freelance marauders on land from capturing and selling people wherever a vulnerable source of supply might exist. Thus, North African pirates raided the Mediterranean coast in the 16th and 17th centuries, while pirates, I was going to say parasites, but they kind of are, in Asia, parasites is what I'm trying to say. Anyway, while pirates in Asia raided islands in the Philippines and sold the people captured to buyers in Borneo, Borneo, the Celebes, Celebes, and other islands in the Pacific, the Spanish colonial authorities who controlled the Philippines organized resistance against these pirates, but it was not until the United States took over the Philippines in 1898 that slave raiding was stopped. In the French colony of Senegal, slavery itself was still thriving as late as 1904 through the slave trade, though the slave trade had been reduced earlier. The Portuguese did not put an end to the slave trade in their colony in Guinea, Guinea, or Guinea, until just before the First World War. Oh, wow. Where European colonial military forces were spread thin and relied on quote-unquote indirect rule through indigenous authorities, as in much of Africa, local European colonial officials often found it expedient to turn a blind eye to the continued existence of slavery and the slave trade among the indigenous peoples, who saw nothing wrong with it and depended on it for a livelihood. However, this simply provided more fuel for exposés by European missionaries and journalists, leading eventually to still more pressure from the home governments to stamp out slavery. As one British historian put it, in quotes, public opinion would not tolerate even vestigial slave trading in an area controlled by Britain, end quote. One sign of the difference between the history of slavery in Western and non-Western societies is the very different language used to describe the very different processes by which slavery was ended in these societies. For the European offshoot societies of the Western Hemisphere, the term was the quote-unquote abolition of slavery, while for Africa and the Middle East, the term was, in quotes, the decline of slavery. Oh, wow. A much more uneven and protracted process in which local peoples continued the practice whenever and wherever they could escape the scrutiny or the power of European imperial authorities. In Asia as well, slavery continued to exist in backwaters and hinterlands on into the early 20th century. Writing in the last decade of the 20th century, a scholar observed, slavery in Southeast Asia is not a remote historical phenomenon. Laws certainly have prohibited private ownership of persons for a century or more, yet in more hills and islands of the region, one still encounters people who admit to being slaves or the children of slaves. Wow. Even independent, non-Western nations were pressured to end slavery, both directly and by a desire not to be embarrassed in the eyes of the world. Meaning, during the 19th century, most of the powerful European world, in short, where European and European offshoot societies held direct and ineffective power in the 19th century, slavery was simply abolished. But where the Western world's power and influence were mediated, reduced, or otherwise operated only indirectly, their non-Western peoples were able to fight a long war of attrition and evasion in defense of slavery. Right. A war which they had, however, largely lost by the middle of the 20th century, but which they had not yet wholly lost even at the beginning of the third millennium, when vestiges of slavery remained in parts of Africa. Despite all this, those with an instrumental view of history have managed to turn things upside down and present slavery as an evil of quote-unquote our society, or of the white race, or of Western civilization. Exactly my point. Let's see. One could as well do the same with murder or cancer, simply by ignoring these evils in other societies and incessantly denouncing, their presence in the West. Yet, what was peculiar about the West was not that it participated in the worldwide evil of slavery, but that it later abolished that evil, not only in Western societies, but also in other societies subject to Western control or influence. This was possible only because the anti-slavery movement coincided with an era in which Western power and hegemony, H-E-G-E-M-O-N-Y, I don't know, never seen that before, were at their zenith, so that it was essentially European imperialism which ended slavery. The idea might seem shocking, not because it does not fit the facts. Well, it's shocking to me because it don't fit the facts, but because it does not fit the prevailing vision of our time. That's true, that too. Selective moral indignation, bring it. Many who are selectively indignant about the immorality of slavery in American society or in Western civilization do not merely pass over in silence the larger scale slavery in other parts of the world, but sometimes even attempt to apologize for the latter. The argument often used by apologists for slavery in the antebellum American South, that slaves were treated, in quote, like members of the family, end quote, has often been uncritically accepted for African or Middle Eastern societies, though dismissed out of hand for slavery in the United States. Some of the forms of involuntary servitude in non-Western societies have even been said not to have been, quote-unquote, really slavery, though scholars have differed among themselves on the definition of a slave. I'm going to tell you, people were treated better than depicted. I'm trying to tell you that, and I don't know how else to say it, but he said it here. The treatment of slaves has varied enormously, usually according to the kinds of work that slaves did. Around the world, plantation slaves have been almost universally treated worse than slaves used as domestic servants. For example, given that plantation slavery was more common in the Western Hemisphere than in the Ottoman Empire, where slaves were more likely to be domestic servants, an argument could be made that the treatment of slaves in some societies was in general worse than in others. However, the high mortality rates and low reproduction rates of slaves in the Islamic countries should caution against accepting self-serving arguments that slaves were treated, quote-unquote, like members of the family in that part of the world, any more than in American South. The absence of a critical literature or an anti-slavery movement outside the West left the abuses of slaves in non-Western countries without the kind of exposure or denunciation that such abuses provoked in European and European offshoot societies. Even so, terrible mortality rates were known to exist among slaves in Egyptian salt mines or among slaves in Iraq. For all the domestic slavery of Africa, there were also slave plantations in East Africa and on the island of Zanzibar, and some African and Asian slave owners used their slaves as human sacrifices in religious ceremonies, as did the Mayans in the Western Hemisphere. Now, I don't know about you, but I've never been taught that the Mayans have part Mayan DNA, that there were slaves there. I didn't know that. Europeans enslaved by North Africans were often used as galley slaves, G-A-L-L-E-Y, which could be killing work. But slaves or former slaves in non-Western countries did not have an audience for stories of their oppressions comparable to that of slaves or former slaves in the United States, where the experiences of Frederick Douglass and other former slaves were widely publicized outside the South. The lone exception would be the narratives of European slaves in North Africa after they were ransomed or escaped back to Europe, or the stories told by the smaller number of Americans who were enslaved in North Africa and then rescued by the U.S. Navy in the early 19th century. We'll leave it there. Don't go hang, till we meet again. Love you, minute.